Welcome, everybody. My name is Jocelyn Viterna. I'm a professor of sociology here at Harvard University, and I'm going to give a brief context to our panel before introducing our speakers today. But first, a few notes of administration. If you would like interpretation, there's a little interpretation button at the bottom of your screen, and you can pick English or Spanish. Entonces, si usted necesita o prefiere escuchar en español, por favor busque el botón al fondo de la pantalla que dice interpretación y puedes escoger español. I'd also like to let you know that at the end, we will have a question and answer period, and you will be able to submit your questions through the question and answer button at the bottom, written questions that we will then hopefully be able to answer all of your questions. Finally, I'd like to let you know that this is a recorded session, and we will post the recording and make it available on our YouTube channel shortly after this webinar concludes, if you'd like to see it again or recommend it to somebody else. So without further ado, let's get started. A little bit of context for this panel. As many of you probably know, for the last 500 years, Central America has been the target of many other nations' geopolitical interests, in part due to its importance as a trade route between the Atlantic and the Pacific, in part due to its natural resources and excellent agricultural climate, and in part due to its proximity to US markets. In El Salvador in particular, this international intervention famously fueled a civil conflict between 1980 and 1992. And in the 30 years since that civil conflict ended, democracy has held in El Salvador, with power primarily being shared between two major political parties, ARENA, which is typically aligned with the political right, and the FMLN, which was typically aligned with the political left. But by 2019, the Salvadoran population was hugely disillusioned with both parties, and they overwhelmingly voted to elect a third-party candidate, a young politician by the name of Nayib Bukele. Bukele won an amazing 54% of the vote, even when he was running against two established party candidates. And Bukele's population has endured. By 2021, when there were legislative assembly elections, Bukele consolidated his power by forming a political party called Nuevas Ideas, and his political party won 56 of the 84 seats in the Legislative Assembly. That means his party now controls more than 66% of the power of the legislative branch, as well as the executive branch. Now, there are many who support Bukele. Indeed, his official approval rating hovers around 90% much of the time, and it's not fallen below 75% since he's been in office. Bukele's supporters argue that he's getting rid of, quote, politics as usual in El Salvador, and he's ushering in brave new ideas and opportunities for development. One of these new ideas was to legalize Bitcoin in September of 2021. Bukele argued that legalizing Bitcoin will spur investment in the country, it will facilitate remittances, and it will help the 70% of Salvadorans who don't have access to traditional financial services. And certainly, given El Salvador's history of foreign intervention, this notion of working around the existing financial system probably has some intuitive appeal. For those who critique Bukele, they typically point to evidence of corruption in his administration and what they see as authoritarian-like tendencies. Specifically, they recall how he called in the armed forces to occupy the Legislative Assembly to assure a vote was taken early in his presidency. They recall how his party deposed 5 Supreme Court justices immediately after taking control of the Legislative Assembly. And just this past Sunday, the Nuevas Ideas-controlled legislature enacted a state of emergency, which it said was necessary to combat a dramatic increase in violent crime. This state of emergency suspends certain civil liberties for 30 days and has already led to hundreds, and I hear it's even up above 1,000 arrests right now, which again, the supporters claim will stop gang violence, but the detractors say are just arbitrary arrests, and clear threats to democracy. And although some of Bukele's critics our critics are actually quite open to seeing the possibility of Bitcoin, many nonetheless worry that adopting Bitcoin will facilitate corruption and money laundering, will harm the environment, and will result in unstable markets that ultimately harm those most in need. Now, I myself studied El Salvador for many years, and after Bukele's announcement that they were making Bitcoin legal tender in El Salvador, I received a number of calls from journalists asking me, what does Bitcoin mean for El Salvador? To which I typically replied, I have no idea. So I talked to Laura Alfaro, my colleague in the business school, and we worked to put together this panel to think more about this topic. Our first speaker is going to give us an introduction to cryptocurrencies in general and what they mean for development. Christian Catalini is a co-creator of Diem, formerly Libra, and the chief economist of the Diem Association. Christian is the founder of the MIT Cryptoeconomics Lab and a research scientist at MIT. He holds a PhD from the University of Toronto and a Master of Science in Economics and Management of New Technologies from Bocconi University in Milan, and his research has been featured in many prominent media outlets, including Nature, Science, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and The Economist. And Christian's presented his work at a variety of institutions, including the Rockefeller Center today, but also the Federal Reserve Bank, the World Bank, and the IMF, among many others. Our second speaker is Nelson Rauda Zablah from El Salvador. Nelson has been a Salvadoran journalist since 2013 and currently works for Alfaro, which is Central America's online-only news magazine. He specializes in judiciary and political coverage, and his work has been featured in the BBC, the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, and The Economist. Since 2021, he's covered extensively the implementation of the Bitcoin law in El Salvador, including having conducted many interviews with many of the key players and global experts on the issue. So if you're interested in learning more about Bitcoin in El Salvador after this talk, I urge you to Google Nelson Rauda's name with Bitcoin for a sample of his extensive reporting on this issue. And finally, our discussant and moderator today is Harvard's own Laura Alfaro. Laura is the Warren Alpert Professor of Business Administration. She's also a faculty research associate in the MBER International Finance and Macroeconomics Program and the International Trade and Investment Program, a member of the International Finance Corporation Economic Advisory Board, and the Latin American Financial Regulatory Committee, among many other things. Between 2010 and 2012, she took a leave of absence from Harvard to serve as the Minister of National Planning and Economic Policy in Costa Rica, and she will be leading the question and answer period today to think about what Bitcoin means for El Salvador. So that's enough for me. I'm going to turn it over to Christian and we'll see what we learn. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here to kind of give you an overview of the economics of crypto and some of the interesting technology being developed in this space, including some of the opportunities and challenges that it entails, like any new form of infrastructure. I started studying this topic around 2013, and in 2014 we designed actually a research study at MIT when we gave access to all of the undergrads to what was at the time $100 in Bitcoin, to kind of see what kind of experiments they would do with it, what kind of choices they would make in terms of privacy, in terms of they would use this new type of digital asset. But since then, here you're looking at kind of some of the volumes for Google searches over the years. There's been many waves, I think, of hype and kind of deflation in this space. If you're curious about what happened at MIT back in 2014, well, the majority of MIT students ended up not spending it, this initial airdrop, but actually saving it essentially as a speculative or investment vehicle. And that's, of course, worth a lot more today, many cycles over. It all started with kind of the seminal white paper by Satoshi Nakamoto. They put out a set of ideas that I think were quite novel, not just from a computer science perspective, but more importantly, from an economics and incentives perspective. Bitcoin, which was originally kind of designed or inspired along these lines of a peer-to-peer electronic cash system, so very much as a medium of exchange, I think over the years has evolved more into what proponents call kind of a digital version of gold. So a new type of asset, a new asset class that allows for new types of transactions to happen in the economy and new types of marketplace transaction to take place. Now, what's interesting is, going really back to the basics, Bitcoin solved a long-standing problem in computer science, the double spending problem. When you think about digital assets of any type, think about the attachment to an email, a piece of digital music. Digital assets have all sort of really good properties, right? We can send them around in split seconds around the globe with no friction. We can create copies effortlessly. So there's no cost of production, but also it's very difficult for digital assets to separate the original from a copy. And so if you're trying to build something that looks like digital cash, digital assets are actually quite bad when you think about it, because it can send the same digital banknote to different people and double spend that note. Bitcoin, again, through a clever combination of cryptography and incentives, is the first protocol to really allow you to define digital assets. In this case, kind of the unspent outputs on a Bitcoin ledger that are hard to counterfeit or to double spend. And beyond that, now we've seen a wave of innovation in this space that starts with cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, Ethereum, and others, but really moves into defining all sort of new types of digital assets, from non-fungible tokens, which you may have heard of, have exploded kind of in the digital art space, in media and in digital content, to even decentralized finance marketplaces that use these tokens, these kind of unique coins, for all sort of new types of applications. But what's kind of interesting, and what is often forgotten about how this played out over the last few years, is that someone somewhere wrote some code on the internet, and that code had some rules and incentives behind it. And over time, we've seen a massive deployment around the globe of infrastructure, and here also kind of course, the environmental concerns come up. Essentially to support this network. So when you think about it historically, it's the first time in history where, again, someone had an idea and deployed it in the form of code, and then without anyone coordinating economic activity, without coordinating investment, we've seen over the years the deployment of critical infrastructure to support the settlement, clearing, and updating of this ledger, the Bitcoin ledger, on a global scale. So of course, there's many types of participants, and from miners, which are providing the computing capacity, to investors, speculators that want to kind of ride the upside, to users that want to use this potentially for new types of applications. But what's interesting about this new approach to bootstrapping networks from an economic perspective is that the incentives are embedded in the protocol. What do I mean by that? By joining early, by participating early in this ecosystem and dedicating resources, whether it's computing or trying to drive adoption, you're essentially more likely to benefit in the upside of that system itself. And this will become important, as we think about countries potentially thinking of this as legal tender, because there's an interesting dynamic where whether you're a user, an investor, or a miner, or any other sort of intermediary, whenever you join early in this ecosystem, you can benefit more on the potential upside. So you can think of this almost like equity to some extent in an early stage startup. How did this play out? I think it's always good to have this visually. So back in the day, you could mine Bitcoin or kind of try to solve this very complex cryptographic puzzle in your basement, literally with a computer and a big fan in front of it. But of course, because of economies of scale and because of economic incentives, we rapidly moved from people mining with a CPU, which was kind of the original design, a very democratic idea of like every computer gets one vote, no matter where it is. While people quickly realized, well, instead of using a CPU, I can use my graphic card, my GPU, and mine much faster. All the way to ASICs, so customized silicon chips, which now are very much frontier, get produced just for mining Bitcoin, and have generated really a large-scale deployment of these kind of mining facilities. These are actually kind of sort of outdated pictures. What mining today looks like a lot more like this. So state-of-the-art infrastructure, often going after very cheap sources of energy, whether it's renewable energy that would otherwise not be utilized, flare energy, and alike. And of course, in some cases, also keeping alive coal plants or other infrastructure that's energy producing that otherwise would have been potentially phased out. But I want to stop on this picture because, again, when you think about the evolution of Bitcoin, pretty much in the last 10 years or so, someone wrote some code on the internet. That code had some incentives that promised people this potential appreciation in value. And as a result of that, people have decided all across the globe to make investments and build that infrastructure out. So I don't think historically we have any example when you think about telecommunication, railways, or any other sort of infrastructure of cases where people just literally just built this out in different parts of the globe without a central entity, a government, or a private entity investing in infrastructure directly. So it's the first type of distributed network that we have on the planet. Now, what's interesting is that, of course, there's not only Bitcoin, there's been a number of other ideas that have been experimented in the crypto space. So people have tweaked those economic incentives. People have changed them based on what they're trying to do. Maybe they don't want the wasteful energy consuming computation, so they want something that's more energy friendly. And so you have protocols that are trying to use proof of stake consensus algorithms. In other cases, you may have networks that want more flexibility in the type of smart contracts or applications that you can build on top of it. And so they have more expressive languages on what you can build on. But all this to say that, over the next 5, 10, 20 years, I think we'll see a whole rewiring of the payment system, the financial sector, and a lot of digital platforms as we know them today through crypto-based infrastructure. So, to some extent, what we're seeing with Bitcoin is kind of the starting of a much longer wave of technological innovation of what I would personally classify as a general purpose technology. So think about steam engine, electricity. I think what's behind here, the technology behind this, is going to have a long-lasting impact on a number of sectors over the next few years. Also on the public sector side, of course, realizing that the technology behind all of this can be of great public good, and a lot of interest in central bank digital currency. So essentially building public sector infrastructure that has the same features of low cost, low latency, real-time payments and settlement from a public sector perspective. So upgrading what is often a very fragmented payment system or banking system with more interoperable, more open rails. And so, many central banks are now exploring bringing their coins essentially on these ledger type technologies, with China, DCEP being probably the most advanced project in this space. But taking a step back, what is the breakthrough from an economic perspective? Why should you find what's happening in this space somewhat interesting? At its core, the technology really reduces two key costs. One is the cost of verification. So making sure that some record of digital information is accurate. And that's kind of intuitive, right? So this is a technology that allows you to settle and reconcile information at a lower cost. But the second dimension of cost reduction is potentially the most interesting. This is a technology that has the potential to drastically reshape competition. When we think about the financial sector as we know it, when we think about payments as we know it, when we think about digital platform as we know them, often the players in that space have significant decision power on who has access to the system, under what conditions, and how can you compete. At a core, all of these blockchain-based networks really shift the power balance towards all of the participants. And so when you think about what is the potential here is to take markets that haven't seen a lot of competition, including, when you think about remittances and cross-border payments, and bringing back competition to those sectors through better technology. Now, the reality is, of course, not always so positive, because at the interface between this beautiful digital record that you can have on a blockchain and real life, there's usually frictions. So we tend to call these last mile issues. And those center around things like identity, right? If I'm performing a financial transaction, do I know that the parties that are transacting are parties that society broadly recognized should be transacting? Or are these people trying to perpetrate financial crime or evading sanctions and all of these issues? So I think for this technology actually to benefit society and have positive effect on a number of the things that I think its proponents are arguing, many of these last mile frictions will need to be resolved. What's interesting here is that, especially when you think about payments in the financial sector, both in the domestic and in a cross-border context, as I was mentioning, that second cost is really about changing market structure. And the intuition of why blockchain can change market structure is actually pretty simple. Blockchain and these open protocols at their core support interoperability, which means that if I'm a user using, a wallet that has a small user base, I'm immediately compatible with the user base of a much larger entity. And so people can transact with each other irregardless of who their service provider is. When you think about most networking payments today, about the card networks, those are closed loop systems that try to keep either the merchants or the consumers all on the same platform. And so in a sense, when you're looking at these crypto-based networks, you should think of them as kind of a hybrid between public sector infrastructure and private sector one. And here you have a picture of the early internet, because I think a lot of the dynamics that played out in the early days of commercializing TCP/IP and some of the internet protocols are likely to play out with blockchain and crypto. At a very high level, we're going from a world where you have walled gardens, especially payments in our application, to a much more open architecture. And of course, there's complementary initiatives like open banking and other things that are going in this direction in many countries. But this is kind of a much more global version of that. So what are some of the long-term benefits? I think, once the technology, again, meets all the requirements that we expect it to meet in the next few years to kind of be used safely, I think we'll benefit from lower barriers to entry. So people will be able to provide payments, financial services, and some of these applications at a much lower cost to consumers and businesses. There's going to be lower switching costs, and the typical lock-in that we see on some of the existing financial services will not be present. And so ideally, consumers and merchants will be able to switch if they're unhappy with a specific provider much more easily than they can do today. It also allows you to unbundle products and services, including in banking, that are bundled together. If you think about our payment experience, for example, often credit and payments are bundled together as a single product. Now, for the very well-banked segments of society, they get rewards, they get all sort of benefits from those combinations, but segments that are typically unbanked and underbanked suffer, even in developed nations. So, even in the United States, if you think of, payments being an area where most people in the United States don't think there's a problem, well, it turns out that, we have a large segment of the US population that's not only unbanked, but underbanked. It's about 7% on average, which is the trailing level for any G7 nation, but it goes all the way to 14% for the bottom 40% of the income distribution. So when we think about payments and the financial system, I think there's a lot of room for expanding financial inclusion, even in the United States, and of course, also in many other countries. It's also a technology that allows for better privacy. And of course, like any technology, that better privacy can be used for good purposes and for bad purposes. And it all depends on the implementation. So think about, for example, with CBDCs and DCEP, the government could have additional powers in kind of observing all transactions in society, and that could be kind of a risk. But you can also build privacy in these systems so that maybe a service provider doesn't need to know too much about your financial transactions above and beyond what they need to do to serve you, so that your financial transaction data cannot be resold or repackaged to a third party. And I think also from a public sector perspective, there's a lot of potential here for increased transparency and accountability. If you have these transactions on a public ledger, then you, of course, anything from welfare disbursement to some other programs could become a lot more accountable and transparent. So I think there's a lot to look forward to. Of course, there's a challenge here, which is a lot of the technology is about removing traditional intermediaries from the picture. So if you think about doing a remittance payment, typically those go through either financial institutions or remittance services. On a blockchain, technically, you could send remittances directly between a user and a user with no intermediary in the picture. And the challenge here is that often these intermediaries, of course, are regulated, monitored, and have to fulfill a number of requirements that really ensure that those transactions, for example, respect AML, CFT, sanctions, and whatnot. So as you think about the transformation that crypto is bringing for a number of sectors of society, there's always this tension between being able to deliver new types of products and services, being able to lower costs, being able to improve competition and actually open up for competition markets that have not been challenged. The average cost of a remittance is about 7%. and that adds a wide dispersion. So in some cross-border flows, right, those fees can be as high as 20, 30%, which is absurdly high when you think about it. So these are markets that I think crypto will bring a lot of benefits for consumers in the long run. But when you look at all of these innovations, because often they've removed the traditional intermediaries from the picture, how do we make sure that those transactions, those marketplaces really respect society's values and principles, from basic things like compliance to more complex issues when it comes to decentralized finance around market integrity, avoiding insiders taking advantage of particular sources of information and whatnot. So I think at a high level, what's really interesting here is that often people think of crypto as mostly software and code, but it's going to be the combination of software and code and good new types of institutional arrangements that will enable, I think, what is the really big potential for crypto to benefit society and mitigate some of the potential side effects, including, I'm sure, some of the issues that we'll discuss during the conversation today. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm going to jump right in with the presentation. Thank you, Kristen. It's definitely very interesting to and much more technical of I'm going to share, which is kind of how this plays out in the field and in the ground. And El Salvador has been defined as a laboratory, and it sounds really like a term that's a capitalist of chaos, which is like Naomi Klein defines the shock doctrine. But it really is the correct term to use in the sense that one of the brothers of President Bukele, Karim Bukele, said exactly that on the night of the approval of the Bitcoin law, that El Salvador, if you probably have heard about Bitcoin Beach, that was a small laboratory in the country, and that the whole country was going to be a huge laboratory for Bitcoin adoption. And so there's a couple of things that you have to understand about the country. Bukele is a publicist who was a member of the FMLN party, the former guerrilla, and he was a publicist for the FMLN a few years, and then he was a mayor of San Salvador. And then his political career kind of erupted from that base, but then he parted from FMLN and he presented himself as, I think many on America would find echoes to the Trump narrative, in the sense it's a draining the swamp kind of narrative. It's against the same old status, and it's again doing things differently and not really regarding about institutions, but being practical and pragmatical. And that's a lot of what he supports. So let me tell you about the presentation. The first thing that we published in El Salvador, way before, before the Bitcoin law was announced. The Bitcoin law was announced in Miami in June in a Bitcoin conference. But before that, we published that there were some conversations about a national cryptocurrency. It's different than if you're into crypto, you know a little bit about these markets. You know that Bitcoin is and the Bitcoin believers, especially, have a kind of moral superiority against other cryptos. Like Bitcoin is there's a thing about saying that Bitcoin is superior to other coins, and that Bitcoin is like purest. And I've written a lot about, not like in the economical sense that Christian was talking about, but in the culture and as kind of evangelists, in the language they use that is quite religious. So before that, Bukele was having conversations with companies with like Strike, Jack Mallers, and other companies in the crypto scene about launching a national cryptocurrency. After we published this, the presidents and the government discarded it by saying that those were discarded ideas, basically. But I want you to keep this in mind, because what is this really about? So this is kind of how I'm gonna present this. What was said it would do, what the Bitcoin implementation allegedly will do, what it's actually doing, what I think, and some guesses of what it can be used for in the future, and a note on the whole mining. And if probably you've heard about the environmental opposition and criticism of the mining of Bitcoin. this is kind of how this started. It's really rather surreal. Jack Mallers is this guy who you see in the blue shirt here, and he announced on June in a Miami conference in English. Again, you remember El Salvador is a small, really small country, 20,000 square kilometers in the middle of Central America. And we don't speak English as our primary language. We speak Spanish, and not many of the population speaks English. So there's this guy, and he makes an announcement that he has been working in El Salvador, and he gets very emotional. He kind of says that he kind of pissed his pants on how excited he was. And he announces and he introduces a video of President Nayib Bukele, and Bukele announces that El Salvador is adopting Bitcoin as a legal tender. So that sent everybody like cheering and stuff. And in the picture on the left is Mr. Mallers with two of the presidents of the President Bukele, Joseph and Ibrahim Bukele, the twins. They are not public officials. They are not they don't have any position in the government. I mean, it's not even comparable to like in the Trump administration, Jared Kushner and Ivanka had some sort of position. They don't. So they don't have any representation, but they also don't have to comply to any of the laws that you would have to comply if you were an elected official. But they are the ones, they are the power. The three brothers of President Bukele are his closer advisors, and they are the power, and that is outside of the law. So Mr. Mallers says, they asked me to build a Bitcoin plan to give people hope. And this is something about the narrative. I'm saying it's not really about technical arguments, but it's a more emotional kind of thing. And when you send money home, they don't take away fucking half. This is like a little quote. He was talking about remittances. And remittances is a huge part of the Salvador equation because we're a country of 6 million people, and 3 million of us live abroad, and the majority in the US, like in areas like the DMV, New York, California especially. So the remittances sent back from those Salvadorans amount to 20% of the GDP every year. So the remittances are an issue, but there was kind of a fabrication in the sense that nobody in the country was talking about how great or how impositive are the fees from remittances. Nobody was talking about it, but they presented it as if it was something of a huge problem. And so this is a little fact checking that I did. Around 70% of the population is non-bankerized, and in Western, this is what they said, like in Western Union or other services charge 30 to 50% fees on remittances. And the other part is what's actually true. Remember and keep in mind, Bukele is a publicist, and everything that he does is kind of done in a publicity and an advertising kind of way. So it's true. A central bank report from 2016 said that 77% of Salvadorans didn't have a savings account. So it's true that the country is under bank or non-bankerized at all. But it is misleading, certainly, to say that companies charge up to 30% of fees and remittances. That's not true in any case that I am aware of. In Western Union, yes, it charges fees, and the fees, if you consider 6-7%, even 10% in some cases, I'm told, it's huge, but it's not 50. So it's kind of an exaggeration in that sense. And this is kind of how it has worked. So the law was announced in June, came into effect in September. Only 2.1% of remittances sent between September and December were sent through digital wallet, and it amounts to roughly $57 million. You could look at it both ways. You could see, oh, there's a lot of people using it, or you could say it's really it's marginal percentage. And digital wallet transactions were less than 1% of the remittances sent in 2021. And the thing is that and this is kind of a chart of how this is going. There was a spike on the amount of remittances that were sent through digital wallet. This is information from the central bank. In October, it was like 25 million. But then it has been decreasing ever since. And in January, which is the last number available, it was a little under 10 million. So down from December and really down from October. So it doesn't really seem that the remittance sending through digital wallets is something that's catching up. Take into account that El Salvador doesn't have services like Cash App or Venmo, which are really popular in the United States. We don't have that kind of services. here in it's the most common case or scenario is that someone will go to a Western Union or to a pharmacy or to services that allow you to receive and exchange your remittances for dollars, and that we are a dollarized economy since 2001. And this is some, these are in Spanish, but these are some of the slide from a national poll from 2021, from December 2021. It's done by Central American University, UCA, and says how much do you trust Bitcoin? 70% of population doesn't trust Bitcoin, and this is 3 months later. Take into account this. Bitcoin, Bukele is hugely popular, as Jocelyn was saying earlier, but Bitcoin was his first unpopular measure. People really rejected it because you were touching the first thing, and I remember this clearly from my early reporting. The first thing that people was aware of when thinking about Bitcoin, it was volatility. I went into rural areas, and people would say, I don't want the money that is worth something on the morning and something else in the afternoon. People were really keen on this, and they were really skeptical of the use it would be having with them. And then this is, I found this slide really interesting also. It was from December, who do you think has benefited the most from the Bitcoin law introduction? So 25% say the rich, 20% said the government, 19% said the foreign investors, 13% said the businessmen, and only 10% said the population, and almost 3% said the bank. So it's really, this is also what I found on my reporting and talking with people on the streets and saying, who do you think this is for? And this is, well, this is for people who has money. So that kind of contradicts the whole argument that this is going to bankerize people. It's really not. The government built a digital wallet, Chivo, and the same poll revealed that 50% of people who downloaded Chivo just cashed in a sign-up bonus that the government offered, a $30 sign-up bonus, and then never used it again. So it really makes you, and also you have to think, are you really bankerized if you download an app? Yeah, I don't think it works like that. These are some examples. This is a public transportation bus, and it says, we accept Bitcoin. I was there, this was in December when I took this picture. I was there like an hour and ask a lot of drivers, are you know, Bitcoin is like a digital transaction, and in a public, these are not the public transportation, but this is Latin America. This is, they don't have schedules. They are really a wild environment, and sometimes they don't really stop, and they don't have assigned stops. It's kind of really a wild way of moving around, but 70% of people uses it. And I asked several drivers, and nobody said that someone had paid with Bitcoin that day or the day before, and they said that in the 2 months they had been doing this, maybe one person had paid in Bitcoin with Chivo. And that's the reality. You know, people are not really using Bitcoin as a legal tender. So how is it to have a legal tender? Well, for the majority of people, it's marginal. It's simply not relevant. And I think it's mostly relevant for, you know, journalists and academics and foreigners. But for the Salvadoran, it's you can really go and having your life as if nothing has happened. Even the mandatory aspect of the law is not being enforced that way. There's nobody that has been fined for not taking Bitcoin. And when I ask, in the majority of places, they don't have a lot of Bitcoin transactions. Again, this is really early stages, but it's not as successful as the narrative the government has deemed it to be. A survey from the Chamber of Commerce said that 86%, this is a survey from March, that 26% of business and companies that they surveyed hadn't done a Bitcoin transaction ever, and not since the start of the law. This is what I was telling you, the percentage of people who downloaded the wallet, and that 55% of people said they only use it once to collect the sign. And I think this is a part of, and here we're going onto what it is that it's actually doing. This is something that Nick Carter, a venture capitalist, told me in a conference in Miami. He said that I think part of the motive from promoting the Bukele brand into this position of political superstardom, and it worked. And I think many of you have heard about Bukele, and I think also the timing when the Bitcoin law was announced, it says something, because a month before he had staged a coup of the judicial branch of the government. And this that you really have to understand. In May 1st, Bukele's party illegally replaced the Constitutional Court and Attorney General. Bukele was democratically elected, and then he acquired the supermajority of Congress of the Legislative Assembly in a democratical way, and he won the elections fair and square. But his first action of business was to illegally replace the Constitutional Court and the Attorney General. And the Attorney General was doing investigations on corruption, and he's dealing with gangs. And the Constitutional Court, he considered that an opposition, and the Constitutional Court he replaced it with already signed up for the re-election of the president, which is forbidden in the Constitution of El Salvador, but they already gave him the green light. So on May 27, one of his brothers said it's decided. It's announced in June 5. This is something that should be an example of how things work in El Salvador. This is not a democracy. The majority of people or organizations define it as a hybrid regime. Bukele is an authoritarian, and the country is right now under a sort of martial law, a regime of exception, because we had a spike of 62 homicides on Saturday. So this is an authoritarian kind of regime. And how do you pass a law that effectively changes the monetary and policy system in 4 days? Well, you need not to have checks and balances, which are typical of a democracy. And the September 7 was the launch, the launch party and the launch date for the Bitcoin. This is something that I really criticize about some of the crypto actors and characters. Because if you go to and Christian will let me lie, and most of you go to the basics of Bitcoin, like the whole myth of the cypherpunks in California, and the whole myth of like people like Hal Finney and Phil Zimmerman and PGP and privacy and freedom and all these ideas around separating money from the state. How do you just put that aside and to embrace a president and to embrace an authoritarian? It isn't the whole idea to go against the state, but then the first president adopts it, and then the people become fan of a state. That really boggles me, because what he achieved was the changing of narrative in the international media. Like the conversation was not about how he had ousted the Constitutional Court, but how he adopted Bitcoin. So that's really interesting. And these are some examples. This is, maybe you've heard Bitcoin Beach, they say El Salvador is a kid's paradise, although there are only white people and white kids on the pictures. And Bukele praising and say the U.S. government does not stand for freedom, so we will stand for freedom. But then pictures taken like this one yesterday in a Soyapango community, because we are under a regime of exemption, and some soldiers in some poor communities are frisking kids, in the streets. So how do you connect the two narratives, the freedom narrative with this particular narrative? And this is like the international media has fallen in love with Bukele, and he's like the hero for the crypto and the messiah of the crypto community, or some of them at least, and Bitcoin Magazine, and you have all of these ambassadors, because if you Google the news about what the international community thinks about Bukele, he's confronting the Biden administration. He was criticizing Canada for their actions when of this strike with Teamsters, and then you have I always say this. I don't know if this is a symbiotic or parasitarian relationship between an audience that loves a hero and someone who is a narcissistic, egotistical kind of guy that loves being worshipped. So they found each other, and you have a community that loves him because he's touting or promoting the product, and you have a guy who loves worship and who really needs foreign ambassadors and people who talk greatly or good of him in English, because the people in the organizations and human rights and governments are really being skeptical of him, while he's super popular at home. What I think, and these are some ideas that I think it is, the government really needs financing in the moment, and Bitcoin and crypto at large are a way of funding the country without the intermediary, without the IMF, without the World Bank. The panorama of El Salvador, this is the debt service that is scheduled for this year. And as you can see, the big red line is the Eurobond principal that is due 800 million that are due in January, which is the main problem of the government in this year, in this calendar year. So who's going to lend them this? The IMF hates the Bitcoin adoption, or at least that is mandatory. And the government has been negotiating an agreement with the IMF for 1,300 million, I think, dollars, and since March. That's not going to happen. That doesn't look like it's going to happen. The Biden administration has sanctioned several of government officials for this, and we all know the pool that the Biden administration has over these multilaterals. So where are you going to get this money? And then you go to the golden idea, that the Bitcoin bond, which is an idea that was touted in a party in the beach in November, which is a $1 billion bond with a 6.5% interest fee. If you like the risk of the country right now, if you posted the bonds in the traditional market, the fee would be around 20%, like 18%, because of everything that the country has increased in risk in the last months. But this is a bond that is going to be issued by Bitfinex, which is a company that doesn't have a license to operate in New York, and that is based in Kazakhstan and in Virgin Island, and they in Hong Kong, and they like a month ago they established their operations here. So if you put together Hong Kong, Virgin Island, Kazakhstan, and El Salvador, you tell me what kind of pattern we are looking at. And Bitfinex is also writing the law. I know this because we interviewed Paolo Arduino, which is chief of technology in Bitfinex, and he said that they are kindly offering to write the law under which they will operate. And he said this is not a conflict of interest because they are not charging a fee for the issuing of the bond, which is raising eyebrows, to say the least. And this is like a commentary on mining, because there's a whole thing about volcano, and bonds are also called volcano bonds, which again, this is advertising, and Bukele is a publicist, and he's brilliant at it, and his team is brilliant at it, and he has spent millions of dollars in this in a communication strategy. So it's called volcano bonds because allegedly he will invest the money into building infrastructure to mining Bitcoin using geothermal energy, which is powered by volcanoes. But volcano bond is really a cool name, to brand it. El Salvador, if you know miners, they search for cheap electricity in cold weathers because the computers, the hotter the weather or the more tropical the weather, it's more costly to keep the temperature of the ASIC computers down. El Salvador is hot. We're in the middle of the tropics, and electricity is expensive. There's a comparison. There is 13 cents of a dollar for kilowatt an hour, and it's 4 cents maybe in Texas. But the government has offered cheap geothermal electricity to miners. Geothermal energy is the 25% approximately of our energetical index or the sources of energy of the country. But besides the advertising and besides the plans, there's really no evidence of new geothermal facilities underway. What they say is that when you buy the Bitcoin bond, then they will start to build it. But anyway, who knows about geothermal electricity knows that this is not going to happen in a couple of months. And I would really argue that if the Bukele government found themselves with $1 billion in money right now, would they really build a Bitcoin city, which is like the other part of the promise, which is like this kind of Wakanda of cryptocurrency that is going to be built allegedly in the eastern part of El Salvador? And with the macroeconomical panorama, as I showed you, I don't really think that they are going to invest in mining facilities, but we'll see. I mean, if you trust the government, that would be a bet to have. And they are trying to. They are certainly trying to. They are trying to tout it that way and be aware of the Bitcoin conference in April 9, where Bukele is supposed to make a huge announcement. But this is somewhat of a closing remark. for this part it's that Bitcoin was created as a tool of financial freedom by a bunch of anti-government and privacy advocates, and that's the whole story of the Satoshi Nakamoto and all of these people. And the Salvadoran case is probably the weaponization of a cryptocurrency by an authoritarian regime. So that's where I would stop, and I'm welcome and looking forward to the conversation and your questions.
Thank you very much. I really do want to thank you, because you gave us the technical part, which is hard to understand, and I think we're all learning, but also the point of view from the adoption in a country, in El Salvador, and it was very detailed and very rich. I actually appreciated the fact that you mentioned the fees for transfer, Best Western, and indeed is close to 6%. If you were to do a transfer bank to bank, it would be lower. One thing that is particularly costly is when you send money to someone that doesn't have bank, but mostly when they want cash. This is actually the case also to banks. Taking care of ATMs, the security, and the putting money and so on is one of the costliest activities of banks. Many countries do tell banks that they need to have ATMs all over the country and with cash, and that is actually one of the higher cost activities for banks. If they could keep it electronic, for banks it would be cheaper. So again, we're talking about the activity that for banks has the higher cost. And so when people say that we're going to lower the fee, somehow you're saying that it would be because people would stay in electronic payments. And so far, that is not the case. People do prefer to hold the cash. The other is this statistic that people mentioned, that 7% of US people do not have bank accounts, which is true. But when you go and ask them why they don't have bank accounts, 40% say because they have no money. And so that is something that a digital Bitcoin is not necessarily going to solve. And when you go down in the list, 15% say that they're actually avoiding the bank. If you dig a little bit further, are people who defaulted, and so they don't want to be in the system. That they may like Bitcoin because they wouldn't be in the system. But again, one needs to go deeper into some of the reasons. Only 9% say it's because of fees. So again, just put it in perspective. But let's go back to, again, thinking about this legal tender. And what legal tender means is that if you make a payment in a currency and the currency legal tender, that obligation is settled. So if I have a contract and I owe the contract, and if I go and pay in a legal tender, the other side cannot sue me. It does seem that it's still not being enforced. People are allowed to say, no, I don't want your Bitcoin, and there are no consequences. But in theory, if someone pays in Bitcoin, it should be settled and there shouldn't be a consequence. So let me go to Christian, because he presented more the technical thing. And there is one thing for Bitcoin to be a part of a well-diversified portfolio. Do you think it is a good idea for a country to adopt now Bitcoin as a legal tender? You mentioned that there might be first mover advantages. Does these first mover advantages are for people who own Bitcoin as an asset class, or for a country that adopts Bitcoin as legal tender?
Yeah, thank you. So again, and I think Nelson has put it really well, this was a gamble, right? And when you think about being an early adopter as a country, your bet is that by moving first, you're triggering a number of things on the global markets that suddenly change people's expectations about the asset itself. And you could have imagined a scenario where if the rest of the world had received this change much more positively, and by the way, even within the crypto community, I think there were a lot of people that were very skeptical for many of the reasons that Nelson was discussing, then the bet or the speculative investment would have paid off. Because you can make an investment, you make the announcement, and then because of the appreciation, you essentially have a return. But I think the reality is a lot more complex. And whenever we're talking about adopting a new technology, especially a digital one, there's going to be a lot of friction. Not only is Bitcoin now legal tender, but the dollar is still legal tender, which means that people have a choice. And to some extent, what
actually,
is,
that is not what legal tender means. Legal tender doesn't mean you have a choice. Legal tender means that if I paid you in this one, you have to accept.
Yes, but
even though there's another legal, but if I settle in Bitcoin, that is settled. Like you cannot come and say, no, I prefer the other one. No, that was legal tender, it's settled.
Right. But if you think about how it's going to work in practice, it's going to have to go through a digital solution, and all of those will also implement the immediate swapping between Bitcoin and dollars. So I think it sounds, again, like a very large change, but when you look at the practicality of it, I think you're still going to encounter what every new technology encounters on the ground, which is inertia and people unwillingness to adopt. That takes a long time, and it takes time to change habits and behaviors. When you think about the history of mobile money, in the first cases, and Tavneet Sur at MIT has done extensive research in Kenya looking at M-Pesa. The first few times people receive a payment in M-Pesa, they would check their balance like 4 or 5 times a day because they didn't even know, is this money? Is this reliable? And you can imagine what that story would look like if there's volatility in the picture. You would check and now see that the value has gone up or it's gone down. And people are pretty savvy. They've experienced hyperinflation. They experience volatility in their own lives. When an asset exhibits volatility, it's not going to be considered anytime soon as kind of a more traditional medium of exchange. So to kind of answer your question, I think beyond the headlines, beyond the effect of like trying to generate this momentum and maybe driving some appreciation in the value of Bitcoin that would benefit the bet. When you look at the reality, it's going to take a lot of time for Bitcoin to become useful. It might have a lot of potential for remittances because those fees are high. And again, there's a lot of variance where if you're not in an area where you can go to a Western Union kiosk or some other off-ramp, the fees are much higher. And there's delays. It takes multiple days. There's safety risk. You're going to pick up that remittance in an area where you could be mugged. A digital remittance that is low cost is something that we have the infrastructure to deliver. We had it for decades, but it doesn't happen. And the very simple reason is that the lack of competition and incumbents don't want that change to happen. So if you were to look at some of the upside here, you could see lower cost, cheaper remittances developing because of this change. But I think from all intensive purposes, it is not the major legal tender. I don't think the degree of adoption will change meaningfully how people interact with the medium on the ground. And it may not even help El Salvador leapfrog in digital infrastructure. Now it might, but I think a lot of that rests on the wallet, on people's purchasing behavior and things that are really hard to change.
So let me take this comment on the volatility. So you showed us the graph, and indeed, Bitcoin is still very volatile. It's hard to know when it's going to settle. And as of now, we can assume that it continues to be a volatile asset, which makes it complicated to use as money, a unit of account, store of value, medium of exchange. You just don't know the price of milk tomorrow. But in the case of El Salvador, there's still, as Nelson mentioned, the case that the main source of income are US dollars. So I have some statistics. Close to 20% of GDP comes from remittances. Those are in dollars. And El Salvador adopted the dollar to get rid of that exchange rate risk. So now they're making people bear an exchange rate risk, which would be between Bitcoin and dollar, because no matter what, the source of income is in dollar. It seems that people still on the other side want to hold dollars, so there might be another exchange. And on top of that, the volatility of Bitcoin. And you mentioned that things take time. But given these two intrinsic volatilities, maybe get your thoughts both from Nelson and Christian, if you really think in 5 years, just to give some time frame, would we see more adoption? And if we do, what will this uncertainty in the exchange rate mean in terms of what the government said, this will fuel investment? And let me also remind you that even if the country wants to move to China, China also pegs to the dollar. So dollar continues to be king internationally, so there will always be this exchange rate risk. Maybe let me start with Nelson and then Christian.
That's a great question. I don't think the law was approved in 5 days as of being announced, and there was, and the amount of hours that it spent on the Legislative Assembly was 5. So these considerations have not been done by the congressmen and women. This was sent by the president, and the president says, "Word of God, let it be done. Let there be light." That's how things work in El Salvador. So these considerations, which are many, and these and several others that economists and experts in El Salvador are saying, haven't really been put into thought before approving the law. I think there's a couple of doomsday scenarios that need to be considered on why the Bitcoin was necessary. Remember, the government has considered a known, which is not even a CBDC, because El Salvador doesn't, the colon, the currency of El Salvador has not been in use in 20 years. They're thinking about a stable coin to issue a coin. So one of doomsday scenarios is, what if the country defaults? What if the country becomes unable to pay their debts, becomes like, Greece, and there's a scenario like Corralito in Argentina, and you don't have access to dollars, or the government needs access to dollars to pay some of its obligations, then you have this stable coin, which would essentially be, I'm sorry if this is not a technical term, but like paying in monopoly money, with the money that will only be used in El Salvador, because it doesn't have access to the dollar. That's a doomsday scenario, but also we are 8 months away of, if you don't get the $800 million, are you going to be on a default? So it's a doomsday scenario, but it's also a possibility. And we know that the government has had this conversation. I think the other thing is about the experience on the ground has mainly been with the Chivo wallet, and the Chivo wallet has faced, the government wallet has faced a lot of backlash, even from the Bitcoiner community, because it's a promise to pay Bitcoin. It's not Bitcoin itself, and there's been all sorts of problems. Again, think about the rural population. Think about the people who are using it. Think about people who survive with $5 a day or maybe less. The minimum wage is $350 a month. So for these people to lose, they cannot afford to lose $5 or $3 in volatility. That's too much. That's their income for a day. And if you have these negative experiences where you lose the value of your money in a day, or if you have had an experience doing a transaction in the Chivo wallet and it has stalled, it has not been immediate, you have lost money, you're not really gonna trust that another money that you don't know anything about, another stable coin, or maybe like the Bitcoin bonds can be paid in Tether, and we don't have idea what the government wants to do with Tether. The uncertainty in the population is just going to grow, even if Bitcoin price tends to stabilize over time. So it's a matter of not so much technicality, but a matter of user experience, if you like, and that's going to be a huge challenge to overcome. And for people who has already been who already feel ripped off while doing a Bitcoin transaction, it's going to be hard to come back from that.
So let me
answer,
move. Sorry to Christian, but let me add to the question. This one from the chat. On top of the concerns of the double uncertainty, if you want, how to solve another double hop problem for remittances payments in crypto. So the question is there a way to solve the double hop problem for remittances payment in crypto, on top of the fact that it's going to have 2 times uncertainty, the exchange rate, Bitcoin dollar, and the Bitcoin variable?
So I think we're confusing a few things, right? And when I think about which part of this experiment could have some upside for El Salvador, Bitcoin, the network, is actually the more relevant one, not the asset. What do I mean by that? if you have a wallet, a digital wallet, whether it's the government-sponsored one or other options, that allows you to convert really quickly to dollars when you receive a remittance, then you're not really exposed to volatility at all. You're using Bitcoin as a pipe, as a way to essentially have a communication, a cheap communication system between, say, the US, the sender, and the receiver. That's the scenario that I think people will quickly realize is where there's added value here. If you have an experience with lower cost, lower friction, instantaneous payments, people will start sending money more often in smaller amounts, more frequently, because they don't have to pay a tax to the money transmitter. That's improvement, right, for the remittance receiver. That said, I think on the volatility end, people will quickly realize that, unless you put in your Bitcoin side of your wallet just what you can afford to lose at any point in time, you won't be able to rely on it because of the volatility. And of course, things go always well when it's appreciating, but people that have experienced Bitcoin quickly realize there's major drawdowns. Same with gold, right? Gold had a major drawdowns, what was it, in the 80s? It took 20 years for gold to go back to parity if you had bought, gold at the wrong moment in time. These are assets that have different economic properties, and I think, we should be confident. People are pretty sophisticated to learn really quickly in painful ways that they're not good stores of value in that shape or form. So I think to your question on, is there other ways to solve the same issue? I think so. There are other types of networks that can allow for cheap, instantaneous payments and settlement of remittances across borders. And you can have that in the denomination of the dollar, for example, like with a stable coin. That said, these networks are still evolving. And so there's not that many options for many people that maybe are not even digital to get a remittance at a low cost.
So let me ask a little bit about the macro consequences. So I have heard that when the government forces a firm to use it a legal tender, they're using it to pay taxes. And so if this is the case, what are your thoughts in terms of the sustainability of El Salvador debt if everyone starts paying taxes with Bitcoin? And let me add also a question from the chat that was asking about what do you make of the volcano bonds being issued by Lajeo rather than El Salvador government. And again, there's issues here in terms of revenues and interest, but more broadly, usually currencies are held within the central bank. And in this case, they are not part of the central bank. They have been moved to an independent agency. So again, your thoughts in general of the fiscal implications of Bitcoin and the volcano bonds. And let me start now maybe with Christian.
Yeah, I think the challenge with some of these scenarios is that you're imagining something at massive scale, right? And if anything, the evidence to date is that there's gonna be friction. It's gonna take a lot of time for any form of adoption. So the scenario where everybody starts suddenly paying their taxes in Bitcoin, it's just not realistic, and it will take time. Of course, at scale, if everyone was paying their taxes in Bitcoin, we would be in a completely different equilibrium. So it's very difficult to understand what that would even mean. What's more realistic is that some people will hold small amounts of Bitcoin, maybe as an investment or a speculative bet. Most people will convert rapidly to dollars. And from a fiscal policy perspective, I don't think this will have a major impact. If anything, it's creating tension with the IMF. That may be a much more immediate concern that has nothing to do with the actual adoption of Bitcoin in El Salvador.
Nelson?
Yeah, I think the fiscal debt and the fiscal scenario is the most pressing need of the Bukele government right now. And I think a lot of things that we see in the discourse and the narrative have to do with that, in the sense that like they reduce the amount of money that they send to municipalities, and they said it was to avoid corruption, and they did a big scenario because again they are brilliant publicists and advertisers. But then they presented that to the IMF, and it's reported that in the Chapter 4 analysis of the IMF as a fiscal adjustment. So there's a lot of things that have to do with the money. And I don't think the issue of people paying taxes in Bitcoin is not really something that's coming up right now. I've talked to bankers, and bankers say that the operations in Bitcoin are really marginal, that they don't really take it into account, and people are not really doing it. The banks have opened up the possibility of paying credits and things with Bitcoin, but they instantly convert it to avoid the risk. And so like I don't know if the government of El Salvador is holding Bitcoin to as a speculative asset. And I think that's a really important part of it. There's no transparency in El Salvador. And that also goes against the principles of Bitcoin, of open source and collaboration, and that the government of El Salvador has just been declared inactive in the Open Governments Alliance. They are not complying with the requirements. The Institute for Public Information is not giving information. They declared reserve everything on the Bitcoin implementation, everything from the public keys of the government, who controls it. We don't know how the transactions are done. We don't know who the intermediaries are. We don't know what fees they're paying. I don't even know, we don't even know if when Bukele says that they are buying Bitcoin, they are actually buying Bitcoin. He has never presented a proof, a receipt. There's no way of saying that if he says he bought Bitcoin at 9 p.m., did he really buy it at that time? And this is important because it can have a different price at 7 a.m. than at 9 p.m. There's really no transparency. So, and on top of that, the government says that it has made profits from Bitcoin. And I don't, I'm not an economist, but I don't know many ways to make a profit of Bitcoin if it's not selling it at a higher price than you bought it. I mean, I really don't understand. And they said that there's a really lack of transparency that's concerning. And that allows to make all sorts of questions. When you don't give certainty, you allow all of this conspiracy and ideas to pop up. And I think that also is not significant and not good for the investors. And let me tell you, let's look at the timetable for the Bitcoin bonds. They have been announcing it since January, and they said, Paolo Ardino from Bitfinex told me that they would issue it in February, and then they were going to issue it in March 15, and then the Minister of Finance had said that the war in Ukraine had made the markets unstable, and then not, and then Bukele said that they were going to prioritize the pensions reform, and then there was a crisis with public transportation, and now there was a crisis of homicides, and now we don't know when are they going to announce them. And they have been saying for months that they are oversubscribed and that they have $1 billion sure, and the Minister of Finance said that they could use it to pay for the external debt. And we know that they have the numbers and the votes in the Congress to pass the laws and to make it all, and you didn't really have, you really haven't done it. And then you have this other margin of uncertainty, which is they are being issued by Lajeo, which is a company from the government. Has that really been done? Maybe in other countries, but not in El Salvador. And why are you compromising? What if you default? Then we lose control of the Lajeo company, or what are the incentives for the investors? And I don't know if an investor hears all of the series of questions that I ask and all the analysis that all the Fitch ratings and everybody's doing. I don't know if you would advise anyone to invest in this and not just buy Bitcoin if you really believe that the price is going up.
So there's some questions in the chat that have been answered. One is that comparing M-Pesa in Africa with Bitcoin as legal tender in El Salvador is not a good comparison. It is true that that technology takes time to be accepted, but the main reason it has not been accepted in El Salvador is volatility and the fact that the wallet has not been trusted. There was also a comment that given that people do not trust, they immediately go to the ATM network set by the government where they immediately draw dollars. These ATM networks have been, again, established by the government, but the cost is not clear. So there's a subsidy there, if you want there, to these activities. Again, not made transparent, it's not clear how much this is costing, but there's a question to Christian, perhaps, going back to this, that there has been some micro challenges in the Tivo wallet. Is it necessary, and how? If so, what can El Salvador do to create relationships with developers to improve their blockchain infrastructure, again, given the experience with the Tivo wallet?
Yeah, I mean, these things are hard, right? And beyond just having a functional wallet, also ensuring that people with all different degrees of financial literacy really understand what they're dealing with, right? So there's an educational component in the onboarding that I think it's also very important to get right, so that people understand, for example, if I'm holding a balance in Bitcoin rather than in dollars, it's going to be highly volatile. When it comes to looking at how to improve this, I hope that there's going to be more options for consumers beyond just the single wallet that's being provided. And so encouraging developers both from abroad and domestically to build alternative solutions, I think could be a good part of the public initiative. And there's a long history in open source code development where small grants and funding can really build what is public sector infrastructure and code. But it doesn't look like that's something that's been invested in at this moment.
So let me ask a question again about implications. And again, so far, it has not been adopted at a scale that some of these implications might be relevant, but it's a concern. Central banks, as you mentioned, have been moving into the world of digital currency. One concern central banks have is that this is in direct competition with banks. Banks, which you mentioned are intermediaries, and that may have some negative effects, actually have a lot of services, and they're also in the business to screening people, collecting information, and this allows them, for example, later to provide a loan. I had a checking account. For me, it was easier to get a mortgage because of this relation with banks. So they're in the business of relations. They're in the business of solving asymmetric information problems. They usually would get funded with deposits at a low cost and then lend on the other side. Bitcoin, again, and all of these currencies, because they are decentralized, they are a threat to the model of banks. As I mentioned, central banks are very worried that they adopting digital payments means that they will get in the business of banks. So wherever you go with this, it is in a direct competition with banks. Some of it may be good in terms of fee, but all may be ended up in an end to this business with consequences, again, as I mentioned, all the services, mortgages, credit. And so where do you think this will end in terms of potential implications with banks? As you mentioned, we regulate them for a reason, but if they disappear, where do you think it's going to go? And I don't know who wants to venture. Christian first.
Yeah, happy to take that. So I think it's often where people jump with new technologies and assuming that all the intermediaries will disappear. I think the nature of intermediation will change, and so what we call today a bank will be a slightly different institution than what it is today. We'll have new players that will become banks, and we'll have some players that are banks that will fall out of the market because they're not competitive anymore. There's nothing special about banks today when it comes to extending credit or lending. And in fact, when you think about AI, ML, and the kind of data science that can be done in predicting the credit score of someone, things that can be done by the private sector today can be even more advanced than what we see in the traditional incumbent infrastructure. So the question really becomes...
I'm not sure I agree with you. I mean, it is true that
I'm glad
there's a lot of AI, but the banks adopt this AI as well. Like, it's not that they're just checking like the little piece of paper, but fair enough.
There's nothing about Bitcoin changing that relationship. So if anything, again, this is a technology that unbundles things that are often in the same type of institution and makes it more modular. So in a world where you're holding mostly digital assets instead of deposits, the custodian is a completely different type of company than your current bank. And the services that you can buy on top of it are a lot more modular. The CBDC, by the way, has the same effect as digital currency or Bitcoin. CBDC also presents challenges of bank disintermediation, depending on how it's implemented. And so I think there's a broader question as we move to these new types of networks. How do we really bring back all the protections, all the things that we care about, including anti-money laundering, compliance, sanctions, all the piece of infrastructure that resides in banks today, in payment processors and others, and I think will eventually appear in crypto. And you're already seeing that transition with regulated exchanges, for example, in the United States.
Nelson, and in particular, this is a concern for us developing countries. We never had enough financial intermediation to begin with, and now there's going to be a competition against the existing model, and it's unclear where this ends.
I think I agree on some of the uses of the technology. I think if you had a case for the remittances to be sent swiftly, the SWIFT system of the banks, I hate it. Every time I get like a payment from the United States, you have to wait like 7 days, and the banks charge a fee. So if I could just have like a Venmo or a Cash App, and that this is what the blockchain technologies allow. I think there's an argument, and I think there's so much positivity in the crypto environment about this is going to promote financial inclusion, and this is going to be essentially trickle down economics. Their benefits are just going to translate, and I don't think that's going to work as that, because you have to think about financial literacy. You have to think about people knowing English. The main resources of education are in English, and you have to think about if this is not going to be just a translation of the inequalities that we have in the fiat system to the crypto system. And I think that's a concern, and I'm not as optimistic that that's going to happen. I don't think the saying of just saying magical words of financial inclusion don't ensure it, unless you have a government and public policies that ensure that those benefits are going to go down to everybody. And we have been historically very bad to translating the benefits that the upper and middle class have to the people who need it the most. How do you translate the loans to the people who actually need it, and not just give it to the people who have good credit scores, right? And this sort of thing. So I'm not really that optimistic in that sense, and I think obviously the technologies always move faster than the crimes, but that's one of the major concerns. What about KYC? What about money laundering? And this is one of the first concerns when the Bitcoin was implemented. I think people, and something that was said, it was, people are going to move their money in the Bitcoin network and they are going to cash out in El Salvador. When you understand the nature of Bitcoiners, it's not like that so much. Bitcoiners are not that much interested in cashing out, but in hodling and this sort of things. But it's certainly a concern. And I tell you one thing, there's no way the institutions in El Salvador are prepared to deal with that kind of things. And we have had a spike on cybercrime in El Salvador in the last year. I have the statistic, but there were like 4,500 cases reported to the Attorney General's office, and the previous year have been like 600. It's absolutely spiking, and people are also being made more vulnerable to it. I've seen all sorts of scams, like the classical, the Nigerian prince scam happening on WhatsApp, and I think really being in a predatory kind of way and stalking people with gullible people. And again, I go to the thing of financial education. There's a lot of people who is interested in cryptocurrencies because they think it's a way to win the lottery in some sort, and that makes you vulnerable to Ponzi schemes and to buying into something without really having. There's a benefit to being able to invest in a speculative asset, of course, but there's also a huge risk, and I don't think that's being talked about. And who are really going to pay the price? It's going to be the most vulnerable people, and the institutions are not prepared at this moment to defend them.
So why there's no Venmo? You mentioned that most people don't have a checking account, and usually it goes from a checking account to another. Is that the reason?
No, that like the technology really doesn't work. There's not a lot of systems they are starting now. Systems
Okay, I
that
see.
function similarly like Cash App. But then again, this only serves to the 30% of the population. 70% roughly don't have even a bank account for different reasons.
No, and again, one issue is that people want to hold the hard dollar under the mattress. So that if that is the final desire, whatever you do digital has to have a way for people to go back to the hard dollar, and that is costly for any system.
And a lot of it is a subsistence, like a survival economy. Like you really don't have. Why do you need a savings account when you have never have any savings and you will never have them? If you earn $300 a month and you have 5 kids and you live in a rural area, when are you able to put $1 away? It's really like 40% of the country lives under the line of poverty.
So let me go a little bit into this lack of transparency. You mentioned that there might be Christian, you mentioned there might be ways to make it more accountable, but I thought at the core, the advantage of the system was the lack of transparency. So how can it be made the information public? And again, this not only has implications, as you both mentioned, for crime, sanctions, so on and so forth. But for example, of a sovereign state that is taxing people, if everyone starts to go to technology that you cannot find out if they have assets, income, etc., this will erode the taxing base of a country with additional fiscal implications. So how can this system be made more transparent? And if that is desirable?
First of all of the Bitcoin transactions on chain are completely transparent to everybody. They're fully public. If anything, you have the opposite problem of, yeah.
No, sorry. I meant the identity of the person, not of the transaction.
Yeah, and that's the part that needs to be built, right? So when I was showing that slide about last mile frictions, building identity, building things like the travel rule, right, in these systems is going to be really important for them to reach mainstream adoption. You can't do compliance without good KYC, and you can't stop bad actors from abusing the system if you don't bring some of the infrastructure that we built elsewhere. But that should not be an excuse for, I think, not upgrading our current system and bringing more competition to segments that, again, haven't seen a lot of competition for decades. And the reason why people have to pay so much for sending money abroad is because of concentrated market structure. Remittance fees tend to be much, much higher when the receiving end doesn't have a lot of options, and when people have one or two providers that are not, competing really with each other. So again, if we extrapolate for a second from the context of El Salvador, which is extremely complex, and I think Nelson has done a much better job at explaining why things are very nuanced there. There's good in the technology that transcends, I think, the current situation, and that's what we should be probably focused on. Together with all the issues you raise around compliance and making sure that anonymity is not a feature of the technology.
Nelson?
I tend to agree in the sense that, like, the Salvadoran case is really particular, and it's really, you really have to understand how people, like in Nigeria, which is going to be the most populated country in the world, is using Bitcoin, or people in Lebanon, or people that are in like in Venezuela, in context of hyperinflation, have been able to benefit from the technology. And I agree that this is not the whole of it. I'm centered, and my experience tells me the experiment. And maybe I would close out with that remark. I've been having these conversations with a lot of characters from the crypto scene, and I was having this conversation last October with a filmmaker from the UK, and he said, like, well, this is a great environment for experimentation. I replied, yeah, maybe you should experiment in a place like Finland or Sweden, where there's less consequences, where you're not betting the money of everybody. And he said, yeah, but this would never happen in a place like that. And I said, yeah, touche. It has to be an authoritarian regime, a democracy, a weak democracy. And I think that's kind of the feeling that we are all kind of rat labs. It's not a good one to have. I think there's a lot of freedom in the technology and in the basis of it that is good. But the fact of the matter is that Salvadorans do not have, we are all Bitcoin investors. We are all Bitcoiners because there's $200 million of public funds that have been invested in this technology, whether to buy Bitcoin or to buy infrastructure or to fund the implementation of the law. So I think this is an experiment that so far is, I'm not going to say it's going badly, but it's at least I can say and I can assure you that it's not as good as the government is saying it is, and that I think it's really interesting to see it from afar. But as a Salvadoran, I deeply regret that we are the subjects of this laboratory.
Well, it's 7:01, and I'm mindful of the time. Thank you very much for sharing time with us. Thank you, Nelson. Thank you, Christian. I learned a lot, and I hope all our viewers as well.
Thank you, everybody. And again, we will post the recording of this to the Dr. Class YouTube channel shortly. Thank you all for coming. And wow, fantastic presentations by everyone. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.